Politicians come and go, but the intelligence relationship stays really solid. Even when Trump was attacking CIA and accusing GCHQ of tapping his phone, according to source, the relationship between CIA and MI6, between NSA and GCHQ, and between FBI and MI5 remained really, really deep.
Hello. As we all now are aware, Donald Trump will be the next American president. This episode looks into the intelligence and foreign policy implications, taking into account the US and UK's shared history. As we've seen in the past few weeks, historians are the ones to listen to, not so-called political experts. And so Michael Smith, author of The Real Special Relationship, joins to discuss the new Trump appointments, Trump's plans for the Middle East and Ukraine, and what may happen vis-à-vis China and Taiwan. Michael is a long-standing journalist, former intelligence operative, and the historian of many books on espionage. Plenty more history to come, including the Battle for Aachen, Charlie Higson on the monarchy, and much, much more, so please do subscribe, follow, and do share with the like-minded. But until then, it's me talking with Michael Smith on Trump, foreign policy, and intelligence. Michael, great pleasure to have you back on. Thank you for joining me.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Ollie.
So, Michael, I was very keen to get you on because unless you've been living under a rock, you would be aware that the United States had a general election, and we're speaking a week after, or a little under a week after Donald J. Trump was confirmed as the 47th president, I think. And I wanted to speak to you because you've written a book, The Real Special Relationship, the true story of how the British and the US Secret Services work together. And so I was very interested to get your insight, and this because your book is just excellent on Second World War and post the Second World War, all the sort of key intelligence operations that the two services have worked together on. And we're now in a kind of new era, I think, from when I last spoke to you, when we had a Conservative administration here in the UK and then a Democrat president in Joe Biden in the US. So now the roles have been flipped in both countries. We've got erstwhile Republican president in Trump, and then, of course, a Labour Party here. And I wondered, I guess, first question is slightly away from Secret Services, but you as a historian, I'm interested. I don't know about you, but I was watching a lot of the coverage overnight and the following day, and it seemed that historians seemed to have a kind of handle on what was happening in America, much more so than many, one would imagine, clever, tuned-in politicos who seemed to be completely flabbergasted by the Trump victory. So I wondered what you thought about historians who seem to, I don't know, they just seem to not be surprised by the Trump victory. Were you surprised?
No, I wasn't surprised. I was a bit surprised that the pollsters got it so dreadfully wrong. But equally, if you're telling people that if you want to vote for Trump, you must be a misogynist racist, it's hardly surprising that when a pollster asks them who you're going to vote for, they don't say Trump. So, the pollsters got it dreadfully wrong. I think there was one polling company over here that actually did it pretty well using internet and novel techniques with the internet. But I think there have been a number of books, and I read a very good article in the New York Times. Paradoxically, you would think New York Times would not be the newspaper to write this sort of stuff, but it was talking about how the political elites have completely lost touch with reality and how small they actually are in terms of the population at large. And obviously, most people aren't that interested in politics, certainly as interested in politics as what you would call the liberal educated elite, but highly educated elite, university educated elites, and particularly those who work within Beltway or with in the Whitehall bubble in the UK, and so they have lost touch with reality. They do think that their views are, by extension, the only views that any sensible, rational person could have, and it's just not the case. And I live out in a rural community, and you can't sometimes, and I've spent much of my life as part of that liberal political elite, and you come out of that and see reality on the ground, and these people think that they're the only successful people in the world, and it's the difference between very, very good book. I can't think Financial Times journalist for a very long time, very, very good journalist, top journalist throughout the period when I was a journalist, and he wrote this book about somewhere people and everywhere people.
Oh,
and
David Goodhart.
Everywhere people, they don't mind where they go, and then they tend, therefore, to cluster in metropolitan areas, particularly London in the UK, but obviously East Coast, West Coast in America. They think they're the only successful people in the world, and no one else could possibly know what they're doing. Well, it's quite obvious that isn't the case. And that in all these other towns and cities and villages and rural areas across America and across the UK, there are lots and lots of very successful people and very intelligent people who just don't want to be part of that liberal elite clustered together in London or Washington or New York or LA.
Yes, it's been quite amusing to see this kind of look of shock on their faces as they realize that other people don't think like them. I wondered though, okay, so we now have a Trump presidency, and he seems to be I think he's learnt from his first term in that he seems to be wanting to hit the ground running by making appointments prior to taking office on the 6th. Is it the 6th of January? No, it's the 20th of January.
Already, we know that Mike Waltz is going to be a very good, I suspect, national security advisor. Marco Rubio is now down for Secretary of State, I think, already. Susie Wiles already Chief of Staff, very early appointment. So I think we are going to see things nailed down. From my own personal perspective, obviously, we need a very strong US national security team. And Trump's suspicion of the intelligence services, which obviously derives from the undoubted FSB actions and operations in America, which obviously he was not himself part of. So he doesn't really get that stuff was going on around him, and you had influence operations which are undetectable to the people often affected by them definitely going on. There's no doubt at all about that. Some of the people around him were very definitely linked closely to the FSB. He wasn't, of course. He was, what the Americans call an unwitting agent, and that word agent sort of throws up worrying signs. People think, he was being run by the Russians, but he wasn't being run by the Russians.
Is this the hotel room and the golden shower?
No. That's that the Chris Steele stuff, and Chris Steele would tell you this, it's what people said, and some of it will be accurate and some of it will be rubbish, and even amongst that stuff, it's some of it within a particular story will be accurate and some of it won't. And so, taking intelligence on its own from single sources as read is a mistake, and Chris Steele would not have done that and didn't do that, and the FBI did not do that when they were doing their report. All of that has made him highly suspicious of the intelligence services. We saw him attack GCHQ for so-called monitoring of his communications. We saw him very, very angry with the CIA. So it's going to be a difficult problem. Who's going to be CIA director? There's some talk that the former director of national intelligence, John Ratcliffe, who was only briefly DNI for a brief while. Initially, the Senate tried to block him. He was former representative from Texas who was regarded as very right wing, who is going to be the new CIA director, who is going to be in charge of various other national security areas. That those are key appointments for me. But the great thing about America, and people tend to forget this when they talk about Donald Trump said this or Donald Trump said that. On the areas they know and understand, Donald Trump says stuff and they say, oh, that's rubbish. On the areas they don't understand, they think Donald Trump is actually telling the truth, and he will end the war in Ukraine in a day, or he can't clearly do it in a day, but within a very quick period. So it's just not as simple as that. And the big strategic policy consideration, if we're talking about international relations, for the Trump administration, is China, the Pacific, and North Korea. That's where they see the big threat, and that's where they need to deal with. And to deal with that, they need to lay down very strong messages to Xi, in particular, because he is obviously the key man here in terms of China and North Korea effectively. And a very strong message is not the sort of message that Biden gave out with the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. I know the plans for withdrawal were put together by the previous Trump administration from the very start. And bearing in mind, as I say, we've got Mike Waltz already in place.
So he's a China hawk, isn't he?
He's a China hawk. He's National Security Advisor. I think that the prime objective here, both within the Middle East and Ukraine, because obviously they're the most immediate issues, the prime objective here will be strategic and to lay down messages to Xi Jinping that you are not facing the same administration as you did with Biden. We are not going to just drop things and retreat into ourselves. And there's lots of talk of isolationism, which in terms of boots on the ground everywhere, American boots on the ground is, I'm absolutely certain, we know from Trump's previous positions, that's true, but that does not mean a lack of intervention around the world. And we saw arguably one of the best foreign interventions made by Trump administration was the assassination of Soleimani, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commander. And Iran will be feeling very nervous right now. So what are we going to do in the Middle East? I think in the Middle East, you are likely to see a continuation of the negotiations of ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel if the current administration haven't already sorted that out before Trump comes in. And you will see some very tough messages laid down to Iran. There will be support for Israel. There will be some tough stuff, again, about how we sort out the Palestinian issues. And the Abraham Accords were, of course, another great Trump achievement. Obviously, they take time to work their way through, but whether Jared Kushner is willing to give up his business interests briefly in order to keep going on that, I'm not sure. There seems to be some doubt, but I suspect if Trump said to him, look, we've got to go and do this, the Saudis are ready now to join that process. And solving Gaza really does rely on probably Arab League troops in Gaza taking over from the Israelis, with probably some limited UN troops, and money coming in from the Gulf states and particularly from Saudi Arabia to help rebuild Gaza, because it is obviously, and we've all seen the television images and depressing television images of an area which could be a very beautiful area because it is a lovely piece of the Mediterranean.
Presumably, Trump falls in line with Netanyahu and Israel's view that Hamas involvement at any level by Hamas is just not possible. Hamas needs to be sort of crushed. Trump goes along.
You can't have Iranian proxies would not be tolerated. Obviously, in Lebanon, that's a different issue. Although one would like to see something happening to help Lebanon as well at some point. Once, if it ever happens, the Palestinian issues are sorted out. But no Iranian proxy is going to be allowed to cause problems for the Trump administration, and Iran will have that made very clear to it at some point. And so, whereas under the Biden administration, we have seen tough action by the U.S. military and U.S. Navy in particular. You will see tougher action, I suspect, at some point from the Trump administration. It may be, if I were the Houthis, I would be very careful about what I hit in the Red Sea right now.
Right.
Because they are an easy target. They will be pushing the Abraham Accords, trying to get Saudi Arabia on board, trying to normalize the diplomatic and trade relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And that will be one of the key elements, as well as making clear to Iran that its proxies can no longer behave in the way that they have been behaving.
Yeah. I was just going to turn to Ukraine, actually, Mick. Yes. So this is the big worry, I think, for many in the West, and probably most sides of the political spectrum here in this country, at least, is that many agree that Ukraine needs to be supported, and that's where Trump probably separates from us. That's probably fair to say, isn't it?
I think that seems to be the general opinion. I'm not convinced because, as I say, all that stuff we're talking about in the Middle East, the main target there, as well as stabilization and normalization of the situation in Israel. When I say normalization, I mean actually progress towards a peaceful Palestinian state, which Netanyahu has put his face against. But again, Trump has enormous power and is not someone to turn down. So that's one of his assets out there in the international world. But I'm making is that normalizing that situation, stopping the Iranian proxies doing stuff, and laying down a very firm message to Iran sends a message yet again to Xi. And that's what you're looking for. You can't mess around with America. And of course, Trump's own unpredictability goes to that as well. So it helps, oddly enough, the very thing that his opponents cite does help. And it helps also in Ukraine. Now, obviously, he had a very close relationship with Putin. We know this fairly clear that they got on well. But again, the administration will not just want to ditch Ukraine. It will not want to look weak. It will not want a sort of Munich 1938 moment because that's sending out the wrong message to China and North Korea. So what will it do? Well, I think there's no doubt at all about this, that people across Europe are going to have to do much, much more. I know we've been doing a lot. The British have been doing a lot for Ukraine. But if you look at Germany, some of its behavior over decades, frankly, has been pretty dreadful in terms of a country that had so much money and not putting its money into its own defense, basically, as a member of NATO. Countries across Europe are going to have to pull their weight.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions since Christmas is coming. Now back to the show.
Germany right now isn't going to be in a position to do much. I mean, the coalition seems to have sort of collapsed.
Obviously the political situation in Germany is difficult at the moment, but countries across Europe, that's going to be one key message from, we know that already, and it's obvious and it's been talked about for a while now, that will be a key message. Europe can't piggyback on America. It has to pull its own weight. But equally, as I say, he won't want to have that Munich 1938 moment with Ukraine. He won't want to fold to Russia. He will. I was reading something that Kurt Volker, who was Trump's special representative to Ukraine, one of the things he was saying was that the US needs to ramp up its oil production, its internal oil production, to put pressure on Iran and Russia, because obviously their funding is hugely dependent on oil and gas. And this idea that you can say to Ukraine, right, we're not going to give you any more weapons, but we are going to sell them to you. And we give you a long-term loan and you buy weapons from us, profits for US defense companies, jobs for US workers. That's all Trump-style stuff. Bear in mind that this is Kurt Volker, who was Trump's special representative for Ukraine. And you can use them any way you want. And we've had this period of weakness, really, where there were very strong suggestions that Putin would use a tactical nuclear weapon in Europe and against Ukraine if those red lines, like using long-range missiles against Russian cities, were broken. And it's interesting, there's a lot of stuff, as we recall, there's a lot of stuff in the papers today about 50% chance, according to intelligence reports. But Putin will have made sure that things looked like he was preparing to do it, or getting ready to do it just in case. And that would have produced a 50% likelihood in intelligence terms on some intelligence reports. And it was, I think, termed exquisite intelligence reports, which means not all intelligence was pointing towards it, just one element. And Bill Burns, CIA director, has been very strong all along that he doesn't believe Putin would carry out a tactical nuclear strike. He felt that was extraordinarily unlikely, and he is he is a Russia expert himself, and not just CIA director. He was ambassador in Moscow for a time.
Michael, I think President Xi has warned Putin.
Yes, he has
as well.
Yeah, he has. Yeah, he's made it clear that shouldn't happen. So I think Jake Sullivan, in particular, as National Security Advisor, has been, I would say, weak on that, frankly. And, we've had, Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak over here at the same time as the Biden administration was not wanting to do this. We've had Rishi Sunak, the Conservative Prime Minister, and now Keir Starmer both saying that they feel Ukraine should be allowed to do this. So use long-range missiles against Soviet Union and Russia, and should be given the ability to do that. Sorry, the historian in me came out there.
Well, I mean, you're not the first to mix the two up, because the behavior of Russia is so similar to the Soviet Union, and indeed Putin's control of Russia is so similar to a Soviet leaders. So yeah, I think that's I think we can use the term almost interchangeably now. It's strange.
But the whole point of that would be, you are laying down your own line. You are putting Putin under pressure to come to terms and bring the war to an end. And how they do that, well, there's talk about this demilitarized zone, which is a very good start, really, I guess. But how long that will take to come in, I don't know.
Is there some kind of pragmatic way of doing this that gives both sides a victory? And what I mean by that is you could have a demilitarized zone, and then you could have the Russian troops remain, but then withdraw over 2 years. And then there's a kind of administration that's mixed between Ukrainians and Russians. And then that slowly sort of changes. And so, if there's a really kind of withdrawal for Putin, but it takes such a period of time and looks so fuzzy that he can get away with it domestically.
Yeah, I think that's the sort of area that we are looking at. Certainly, and the demilitarized zone is a start on that. But I think it will take time for that sort of process to come into play. It's not going to happen within a day. It's certainly not going to happen within a day of the administration taking over. And it will take months, if not, a couple of years to sort this out. The problem for Trump is that he doesn't have American boots on the ground like he did in Afghanistan. He just can't pull people out. He obviously can stop supporting Ukrainian troops, but the Brits will continue to do it. He can pull out, say, I'm not sending any money. I'm not sending him any more equipment. The clever thing about Volker's, and I have no idea if it's him coming up with it, or it's stuff that I imagine it's stuff that's been talked around among Trump's advisors, if Volker is talking about it, that the idea of saying you can buy as much as you want from us and we'll fund it with a loan really does put pressure on Putin. And it really does force Putin to think, how am I going to get out of this? And that's the key thing here. The Zelensky, obviously the Ukrainians aren't going to give up everything. There is talk in Ukraine amongst Ukrainian officials of which has been put in front of Trump, as I understand it, of Ukrainian troops at the end of the war, Ukrainian troops being based in Europe, replacing American troops. So that would involve some sort of NATO involvement by Ukraine. And Trump apparently reacted very well to this.
Sorry, Michael. How does that look? How do you mean Ukrainian troops in Europe? Do you mean replacing US troops in Germany and places like that?
Yes, that's precisely what the idea is. Now, obviously, Ukraine would have to be a member of NATO for that to happen. We're talking here, long-term supposition, but the Ukrainians are sick and tired of the Biden administration anyway, and it's particularly Sullivan's break on crossing so-called Putin red lines. So they are very keen to see something different, and they are prepared to think in an imaginative way. And it doesn't matter whether that is ever likely to happen, Ukrainian troops in Germany or Ukrainian troops in the Baltic republics. It's something that appeals to Trump and puts Trump much more on their side. It's part of the way of managing the situation and recognizing reality. Yet again, laying down red lines to Putin, Trump throwing red lines back at him. Trump saying, no, we're going to sort this out and you are going to help sort it out. That again sends this strong message to Xi. And that is where the administration will be looking, and it will be looking to reverse the Sullivan-influenced so-called apparent weakness of America. It's looked weak on the world stage. And actually say, we're strong, we're powerful. We're not going to put troops on the ground, no. And in those terms, we're isolationist, I suppose. But we are going to make sure on the world stage that what we want happens. There'll be other areas, of course, where the administration needs to look, and we can't forget for one moment counterterrorism, the terrorist threat, and some of the trouble that China itself and Russia is building up across Africa. and Chinese control through the Belt and Road Initiative. All of these things are problems, but they're not quite the immediate problem that obviously Ukraine, Middle East is. And as I say, reversing this situation, this rather weak Sullivan influenced situation where America has tended to look weak, as if it didn't really want to get involved and argue with people.
It sounds like Sullivan, the national security advisor, is running policy as opposed to the president, President Biden.
You have a weak administration. You've got a president who, we've seen Biden's weakness. He's always been very strong on foreign issues. That's always been his interest, a great interest for him. And whatever the domestic issues for US presidents and US administrations, and it's always the economy stupid, to use the Clinton phrase, for the ordinary people. But outside of America, it's always foreign policy that defines US administrations, whether it's Nixon and opening up to China, or Bush and Iraq. So I think Trump versus Xi, and versus is the wrong way to put it. I don't think anyone in this administration is going to be looking to be aggressive towards China, other than in trade terms, because obviously there is the tariff stuff, and Trump is very big on that, but it's not my area of expertise, so I don't want to get involved in that. But no one's going to be aggressive in military terms towards China, unless China steps out of line. But there will be this very strong message to China, and that will be the central tenet of US national security policy, I think.
One thing that has interested me was this assumption that Trump, because of his supposed lack of interest and involvement in Ukraine, would therefore take the same approach with defending Taiwan. But I've seen this mentioned a lot amongst the same kind of politicos that we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast. It would seem to me that Trump is more interested in the threat from China, and actually wants, as presidents since Obama, have wanted to turn attention to the Pacific and move away from Europe and the Middle East. And so they're motivated to defend Taiwan, not least because of its very important role in production of microprocessors that we all use in our toasters and phones and all that kind of stuff. And that would have real implications for the US economy if China were to threaten Taiwan. So presumably that makes Trump more likely to defend Taiwan, even though some of his comments might suggest otherwise.
Yeah, I think so. I'm not inclined to believe that Mike Waltz will be arguing that you don't defend Taiwan. I mean, I know he's not the president, but he's clearly the guy the president wants as national security advisor. And he is very, very, hard line on China, very hard line on China. So, as I say, I think, yes, we've got to sort out the Middle East, and that includes making clear that there is to Iran, then it needs to sort it out and behave itself in a different fashion, and probably in a more amenable way, making clear to Putin that the war in Ukraine has to come to an end, and he has as much responsibility in terms of that, if not more, because he's the aggressor. And it's not a war of Ukraine's choice. He has huge responsibility there, and Trump can't afford to look weak against either Putin or Iran, because they are the other two main authoritarian leaders, and alongside China and North Korea. So I think, we shouldn't be too pessimistic about Ukraine. Obviously, there's a whole lot of pessimism around the Israel situation, the Middle East situation at the moment, because of the deaths of innocents on both sides, but mainly, obviously, in Gaza. But again, Trump is going to be tough with Iran. And as I say, I think, you might well see an American attack rather than an Israeli attack at some point, to make that point very strongly. And to me, it seems like the Houthis are the obvious ones
I see.
They step out of line.
Since we spoke last time, there have been, I think it was 3 Chinese agents or agents of China arrested in the UK. And we've seen a huge number of Chinese students over here and continuing to, after their studies, to start working in UK institutions. And I wondered what the relationship between the US intelligence services and the British intelligence services are in this point, in that we seem to have sort of opened the door in this country to and made ourselves prone to this kind of activity from Chinese agents. And are the Americans sort of pulling their hair out, and maybe even the British intelligence services are too, but it's kind of happened, and we are where we are?
The Americans are in no position to pull their hair out over it, because it's a huge problem in America as well, with a huge Chinese community in America, immigrant community over many years. And the Chinese use people back home to put pressure on Chinese abroad. And that's particularly happened for a long time now in America, and there have been a number of Chinese spies in America as a result. Yes, MI5 and FBI in particular, but also CIA, MI6, looking abroad at how this is coordinated and done, working together, and obviously GCHQ, NSA working together. This is a major issue for the intelligence services. It's led in the UK by MI5 as the domestic security service, of course. And MI5 has made no secret of the fact that there are problems, not just with the Chinese, but also, Iranian influenced people over here, and also Russian, of course, and there will always be the Russians, and there will always be the Russians. So I think it's a big problem. It will be a continuing problem, and it's a problem that the Americans and the British work together very, very closely. Well, actually, I picked out a quote from my book, which because we were talking about this whole business with Trump not trusting the intelligence services and ranting and raving about GCHQ. This is John Soares, who was MI6 chief. One of the qualities of the US-UK intelligence relationship is that it runs very, very deep, Soares said. Politicians come and go, but the intelligence relationship stays really solid. Even when Trump was attacking CIA and accusing GCHQ of tapping his phone, according to Soares, the relationship between CIA and MI6, between NSA and GCHQ, and between FBI and MI5 remained really, really deep. At an operational level, the operation cooperation was as deep as at that time as it had been in the past. There was no change. So the only issues here, because Bill Burns, the current director of the CIA, has been very, very strong on MI6 CIA cooperation, and laid down the lines internally as much as anything else on how strong it has to be if we're going to face down the new world. The only fly in the ointment is who Trump appoints as CIA director. And John Ratcliffe, Texas, very conservative. He was director of national intelligence for a brief while under Trump. His name is being thrown up. He does obviously has a brief amount of intelligence knowledge, but it's not as deep as people like Bill Burns. I really would love it if Bill Burns continued. I think most people in intelligence services on both sides of the Atlantic would see that as a plus point, but I don't know that he would want to work for Trump. So that's the key appointment for me, CIA director, who's going to do it.
It does seem as though if you're not in the sort of Trump boat, you're not going to get appointed this time, unlike last time.
That's true, but equally, he's shown with Waltz that he is prepared to put in strong people who he gets on with, he likes. People, I come back to this Trump bluster thing. It isn't so much what Trump says, it's what the administration does. And US administrations tend to be pretty strong. NSA is totally part of the Pentagon. So, although it's part of the intelligence services as well, but it is part of the Pentagon, so it's within that security blanket, so to speak.
Yeah, it's weird that. But Michael, this has been fantastic. Thank you very much. And for listeners, Michael's book is so fascinating, giving insight into the relationship between the UK and US intelligence relationships and how it's endured and sounds like will continue to endure. So, Michael, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ollie.
Thanks so much for listening. Plenty more history to come, so if you can give a kind review, I'd be most grateful. But in the meantime, thank you and good night.